What would you do if someone you loved began to change? If they started speaking languages they never learned, predicting events no one could know, or worse, doing things that defied the very laws of nature? Could you watch as their body twisted in impossible ways, or rose off the ground before your eyes? This isn't just some ghost story for your sleepover. Though her name has been changed to protect her identity, this is the true account of a young Spanish woman whose life was torn apart by an encounter with evil itself, a battle that would shake not only her family, but an entire village to its core. But what truly happened to Clara Gonzalez? And, most chillingly, could it happen to you? Stay with me as we unravel the shocking story of Clara's possession, a case that revealed the terrifying reality of spiritual warfare. In a quiet Spanish village, nestled between ancient hills, the year 2003 brought a story that would shake the foundation of belief for all who heard it. The whispers began, as they always do in such places, moving like a breeze through the cobblestone streets, touching every ear with fragments of a name: Clara. Clara was known for her gentle nature, her faith unwavering, even in the face of life's usual trials. She was a constant presence at Mass, her head bowed in humble reverence, her hands clasped in prayer. The villagers admired her devotion and spoke of her as a light in the community. But lights can attract shadows, and no one could have foreseen how deeply darkness would entwine itself around her life. It began subtly. Clara spoke of exhaustion that weighed her down like an invisible shroud. At first, her family dismissed it as overwork or perhaps the lingering effects of a minor illness. But there was something in her eyes, a distant, glassy quality that her mother couldn't shake. Then came the dreams. Clara described them haltingly, her voice trembling as she recounted images of faceless figures that loomed over her in the night, their presence so vivid she could still feel their icy breath upon waking. She began to wake screaming, her voice raw and broken, as though she'd been crying out for hours. Her nights were filled with such unrest that her family started praying over her while she slept, their whispered rosaries rising in desperation. It was during one of these vigils that her father saw something that made his heart pound with fear. Clara, asleep moments earlier, sat bolt upright in bed, her head snapping unnaturally to the side. Her eyes were open but empty, her lips moving without sound. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow, her words fragmented. "It's coming," she murmured, over and over, her tone devoid of her usual warmth. The disturbances spread from Clara's dreams into their waking life. Objects moved without explanation. A chair dragged itself across the floor, the thud of its legs echoing in the stillness of the evening. The crucifix in the hallway was found on the floor, its surface inexplicably scorched. Once, during their nightly rosary, the beads in Clara's hand snapped apart, as though pulled by an unseen force, scattering across the room. Clara's behavior began to shift in ways that her family couldn't explain. She grew withdrawn, her eyes darting nervously, even when the room was still. She recoiled from the sight of religious items, her breathing growing labored if they drew too close. Her mother tried to press a rosary into her hand, but Clara cried out, her voice layered with something foreign, something sharp and cutting that didn't belong to her. "I don't want it," she screamed, her tone both pleading and commanding. Her mother froze, the rosary slipping from her fingers to the ground. When Clara began speaking in tongues, languages no one recognized, her family's desperation reached a peak. They turned to the local priest, Father Luis, a man whose faith was as steadfast as the mountains surrounding the village. He agreed to visit their home, though he admitted years later that he didn't fully understand what he was walking into. "I thought it was superstition," Father Luis confessed in a rare interview. "Stories that people tell to explain things they can't comprehend. But the moment I stepped into that house, I knew this was different." The atmosphere of the home seemed to tighten around him as he entered. The air was thick, and a coldness clung to the walls, unnatural in the summer heat. Clara sat in the corner of the living room, her face pale and her hands gripping the arms of the chair as if to steady herself. Her eyes fixed on him, unblinking, with a look that made his stomach churn. Father Luis began with prayers of blessing, his voice steady as he invoked the protection of the saints and the Virgin Mary. But Clara's reaction was immediate and violent. She screamed, a sound so jarring it caused her mother to cry out and clutch her chest. Clara's body convulsed, her limbs jerking in a manner that seemed to defy the limits of human motion. The first exorcism was scheduled for the following evening. The room was prepared with care, candles lit, holy water placed at the ready, and a crucifix hung prominently on the wall. Clara's family gathered, their faces pale and drawn, their hands clasped tightly as they prayed for her deliverance. When Clara was brought into the room, her demeanor shifted. Her body tensed as though every fiber of her being resisted the presence of holy symbols. Her gaze flicked to Father Luis, and for a moment, her expression twisted into something that could only be described as a sneer. As the priest began the ritual, Clara's body trembled violently. Her cries grew louder, her voice layered with tones that seemed to belong to a multitude. She cursed in languages no one in the room recognized, her words cutting through the prayers like jagged glass. Her family could only watch, their hands trembling as they clung to their prayer beads. And then it happened. As Father Luis pressed on, reciting the prayers with unwavering determination, Clara's body stiffened. Her back arched, her limbs jerking as though pulled by invisible strings. Slowly she began to rise. Her body lifted off the ground, her feet leaving the floor as gasps filled the room. Witnesses described the moment as something that defied reason, a sight that would be etched into their memories forever. Her limbs hung limp as she floated, her face contorted in a way that seemed almost inhuman. Father Luis pressed forward, his voice growing louder as he commanded the entity to leave in the name of Jesus Christ. For hours, the battle continued. The room seemed to pulse with a presence that pushed against the prayers, a force that sought to drown out the words of deliverance. The candles flickered wildly, their flames dancing as though caught in a storm. Clara's cries pierced the air, her voice morphing into a guttural roar that shook the walls. In his journal, Father Luis later wrote, "Her body defied the laws of nature, hovering as though gravity had forsaken her. It was a moment that forced me to confront the reality of what I was up against, the presence of evil in its rawest form." The ordeal left everyone in the room shaken. Clara collapsed to the floor as the prayers reached their climax, her body limp and her breathing shallow. The room was eerily silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting just enough for the family to catch their breath. But the battle wasn't over. Word spread quickly. The village buzzed with fear and speculation. Some dismissed it as hysteria or delusion, unwilling to confront the possibility of true evil. But others, the ones who had heard Clara's harrowing screams or seen her levitate as if strung up with invisible cords, knew better. This was no sickness of the mind. This was a spiritual war, playing out in their own backyard. Some villagers gathered outside Clara's home, reciting prayers and lighting candles. They came with rosaries, holy water, and whispered psalms, their voices trembling but resolute. Fear gripped them, but so did a shared determination to stand against the darkness. As days turned to weeks, their vigil became a community ritual, a reminder that they were not facing this alone. The church could no longer ignore the escalating events. Eventually, the bishop was informed, and the case escalated to the Vatican. Upon thorough investigation, Clara's situation was deemed a legitimate case of possession, one of the rare and terrifying instances that the church documents with utmost care. The Vatican sent reinforcements, a team of seasoned exorcists whose faith and experience had carried them through decades of confrontations with the demonic. These men arrived in the village with an arsenal of sacred tools, relics of saints, holy oils, candles, and hand-bound copies of the Roman ritual. They were unshaken by stories of levitation or chilling laughter. They had seen worse. But when they entered Clara's home, even they faltered. The first session began at dusk. The room where Clara sat had been stripped of any unnecessary furnishings. She was restrained, not in cruelty, but as a precaution against the violent thrashing and self-inflicted injuries typical in such cases. The exorcists surrounded her, their voices steady as they began the prayers of deliverance. At first, Clara remained eerily still, her face slack and devoid of recognition. But when the holy water touched her skin, she screamed. The sound was guttural, unnatural, and layered, as though a crowd of voices spoke through her at once. Her body convulsed violently, pulling against the restraints, her muscles straining to impossible extremes. And then she laughed. It was a sound that froze the air in the room, sharp and mocking. "Fools," she hissed, her eyes snapping open to reveal not Clara's familiar gaze, but something darker, alien, and terrifying. "You come with your prayers, your relics, thinking you can save her? She belongs to us now." Father Miguel, the lead exorcist, later described the moment. Her words weren't just spoken, they were felt. It was as though the room itself recoiled, filled with a presence that sought to unnerve us. But we pressed on. The hours stretched endlessly. Clara writhed and cursed, her voice shifting between tones that no human could produce. She named the priests before they could introduce themselves, recounting their hidden sins in horrifying detail. The crucifix above her head fell from the wall, its edges scorched as though burned by an invisible flame, all in an attempt to scare off the praying priests and devoted family members. Clara writhed, straining and convulsing, her movements jerky like she was being manipulated by a puppeteer, as if she were a marionette on invisible strings. She hollered above the consistent intoned prayers, reacting violently and angrily to every Our Father and Hail Mary. The exorcists didn't waver. They weren't new to this. They prayed louder, invoking the names of Christ and the saints, their Latin verses echoing against the cold, unyielding walls. Witnesses later spoke of a stifling heaviness in the air, as if the room itself bore the weight of the struggle. Clara's family knelt outside, their fingers trembling over rosary beads, tears streaming as they begged for her deliverance. Days turned into weeks. The exorcisms continued in relentless cycles, each session leaving Clara weaker, but more herself. The priests were equally drained, their faith tested, but unbroken. It was during one of these grueling nights that the truth emerged. Between screams and writhing fits, Clara spoke haltingly, her words dripping with dread. She confessed to visiting a local site known for occult practices. "I didn't know," she gasped. "I thought it was a game, but they called something, and it followed me home." The revelation sent shockwaves through the village. Clara's family had always been devout, her faith unwavering. If someone like her could fall prey to darkness, What did it mean for everyone else? Father Luis addressed the community one evening after Mass. "Evil thrives on our disbelief," he warned. "We must guard ourselves, not just with words, but with lives steeped in prayer and vigilance." The final exorcism came after nearly 2 months of spiritual warfare. It was the culmination of every prayer, every invocation, every ounce of faith that Clara's family and the priests could muster. That night, the room felt alive with tension. Clara thrashed violently, her body lifting once again from the bed as the priests prayed over her. The air grew icy, and a deafening scream erupted, a sound so piercing it seemed to reverberate through the very bones of the house. And then, silence. Clara collapsed, her body limp, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. When she opened her eyes, they were clear for the first time in weeks. Tears spilled down her cheeks, tracking streams through grime and blood on her face as she whispered, "It's gone. It's finally gone." The priests knelt in exhausted prayer, their voices trembling with gratitude. "The victory," Father Miguel later wrote, "was not ours. It was Christ's." Clara survived, but she was forever changed. The experience left her with a faith even deeper than before, but also with scars, both physical and emotional, that she carried for the rest of her life. She moved away from the village, seeking peace and solitude. Her family home, though blessed repeatedly, remained abandoned, a silent testament to the battle that had unfolded there. For the villagers, the memory of Clara's ordeal lingered. Though some dismissed it as an exaggerated tall tale, most saw it as a sobering reminder of the unseen spiritual warfare around them. Church attendance rose, and families prayed together more fervently. As Father Luis often said, "The devil's greatest trick is convincing us he doesn't exist, but after Clara, no one here doubts him, and more importantly, no one doubts the power of God." Evil is real. It doesn't wait for your belief to act. Its power lies in the shadows, but it is no match for the light that faith brings. But what do you believe? Clara's ordeal stands as a haunting reminder that the spiritual battle for our soul is happening right here and right now, to people like you and me. Today, 22 years later, Clara's whereabouts are unknown. Now in her mid-40s, she's no longer under evil's influence, however. She may still be living through the mental and psychological strain of hosting evil, and that isn't a struggle she needs the whole world weighing in on. What about you? Have you ever witnessed something you couldn't explain, or experienced the battle between light and dark in your own life? Share your story in the comments below. And if this tale left you questioning what lies beneath the surface of our reality, stay tuned for more cases that uncover the spiritual battles waged in the shadows.